Recording has started. I'm admitting the people now. So I see a number of people are in the process of being admitted. And I'm very glad to see you all. My name is Lara Schwartz. I'm director of the Project on Civil Discourse. As I do with my teaching, I'm going to say that I don't think people should feel any pressure to have their video on, whether it's during the Q&A when you're talking or not. So people should just engage and be present in whatever way works for you. As another access question, and that'll be one thing that maybe we can hit on in this session is why that's a decision that one of us might make. As we get rolling, for anyone who wants to use live captioning in order to have full accessibility for the program, if you go into the chat window, you will see a link where the live captioning, our CART interpreter is steadily working away, capturing the wisdom that you're hearing from me right now, and we'll do so for the hour. If you come back to watch this video, which is being recorded, the captions will be installed on it. So it'll be fully accessible and shareable to any friends, regardless of hearing. Or if you just want to watch it in bed silently, as one does. Anyway, welcome all. So I'm Lara, and I am really, really pleased to kick off the PCD's first summer brown bag virtual series. By way of a reminder, our series will continue every Tuesday at noon Eastern. Next week, we'll be doing Pride Across Distance with Charlotte Clymer, followed by Building Faith Across Distance the following week, Activism and Expression, and then ending up with Parenting Way Up Close. But in the meantime, I'm delighted to launch the series with Kevin Gannon. Kevin is, not to embarrass him, but a teaching hero of mine, the author of Radical Hope, a teaching manifesto. He's the tattooed Prof on Twitter, so you might be familiar with his work and commentary on teaching and history and dogs and a variety of other things. So welcome, Kevin.
I should probably unmute myself before I thank you. Thanks for having me, Lara. I'm really glad to be here, and thanks everybody for spending some time with us today.
So without further ado, I'll get going. Please feel free to use the chat functions to ask any questions that you have for Kevin, but as well, the way that we've got the hour set up is that we don't plan to occupy the full hour talking away, and what we're hoping for is some robust engagement and questions from you. Otherwise, we'll just start, talking about Harry Potter and Star Trek and Hunger Games and things, but hopefully you'll join in as well. This is truly a brown bag lunch series, and hopefully it feels like we're all in the room working together. So I'm gonna launch into my questions for Kevin. So Kevin, the COVID-19 crisis and sudden distance learning model that many of us, most of us in higher ed had to switch to if we weren't already online, has spurred a lot of thoughtful discussions about inequality in education. I've personally observed that the new way of doing things is differently unequal, that we're swapping out some kinds of inequalities for others. What problems with access and inequality do you believe actually predate the crisis, and do you feel like there are any ways in which education across distance can address those?
Well, I think one interesting phenomenon of our shift or pivot, as my administration calls it, to online, which, if you've ever seen that old Friends episode where they're moving the sofa and Ross keeps yelling, pivot, pivot, that was the running joke on our campus for weeks. But I think one of the things that really highlighted interestingly was all of a sudden we became super flexible and super empathetic and compassionate for students, not just on an individual level where some of us might have had that as our practice, but institutionally. And so if a student needed an accommodation for this or that, we didn't get hung up on, what the reasons were that we couldn't do that. And I think what got exposed was the fact that a lot of complaining about accommodations and things that go along with universal design and accessibility, it turns out we can do those things. Then, whereas before people would say, oh, it's too much work to have to do all this stuff to make it accessible online. Well, you know what? When we had to go online, all of a sudden we had to do it, and it turned out to actually be possible. And so I think one of the things that we'll take out of this, not that we'll ever go back to a normal, but our new normal, I think, is going to really embrace and should embrace the lessons that we learned about what our sources of resistance were to things like accessibility and just how illusory some of those things were. It just turns out with the sufficient amount of will and resources, institutions can address these things. And in some ways, it just chosen not to. But I do think that what we are seeing, the digital divide is real, and we knew that intellectually. Those of us who've taught online for a while have been acutely aware of it. But when we had this abrupt pivot, and all of a sudden we had students who were maybe international students or students from rural areas. My university has a lot of rural students, and rural broadband in Iowa is iffy at best, right? And so we're making all these assumptions about how teaching and learning can continue and would continue. And a lot of those assumptions were leaving our students out of significant parts of that. So the digital divide, I think, existed for a lot of us in academia kind of on an intellectual level, but it really, I think, in the past few weeks has been brought home on a much more visceral and real level to us. And again, I think some of the solutions that institutions brought into play, there were institutions who say, hey, we have emergency grant money, and if a student can't access the internet, we'll start putting hotspots out. We'll buy them a Chromebook. We'll do this. So again, things that we could do and could have been doing, yet had chosen not to, now we're highlighted by this, by the COVID crisis and moving online. And I hope that we remember that, and I hope that we're able to continue to press for things like that as we move into whatever our new educational normal would be. One of the big lessons I'm taking out of this is that, yes, there are a lot of difficulties and complexities involved, but there are a lot of things that we thought couldn't be done that can be done with sufficient will and resources mustered towards them. And that's what I want to take with me going forward, is we can do these things. Let's look at the choices we've made that have prevented us from doing them before.
Yeah, and a follow-up before I get to the next question. It seems like, so I come from a disability rights field, and my tendency is to be as universal as possible in my teaching and as expansive as possible, to the point that, accommodations aren't necessarily the question. Full access should be. The things that I've noticed talking to students with disabilities, disabled self-advocates, and others is that oftentimes there's a resistance even to individual accommodation requests or entitlements that stems from a bit of mistrust of students. And as we did the pivot, and I love the image of the pivot, friends, as we did the pivot, there was a lot of noise on, my sort of professorial clique Facebook, and among a lot of chatter that I was seeing, sort of like how to make sure the students weren't kind of gaming this system. Like, how do we know you're really in this terrible situation with your Wi-Fi, or really in this rough situation at home? And it seemed honestly to reflect a kind of a rebuttable rebuttable presumption of untrustworthiness of students that rather took me aback. And I saw a lot of conversations about sort of exam camera surveillance. In the online context, in the COVID context, should we be adjusting our mindset toward, the extent of trust that we show our students? Should there be an almost irrebuttable presumption of good faith? How do we hold a mindset that gets us out of this kind of mutual suspicion mode that seems to affect a lot of learning environments and student-school relationships?
Yeah, that's a great point. And a lot of our conversations at my institution and around in my networks too have focused in one way or another on these issues. You know, how do we give exams so they don't cheat? You know, let's surveil them kind of thing. And I think in any teaching and learning situation, but especially in our new sort of COVID online situation, our default attitude towards students has to be one of trust. It has to be one of empathy. It has to be, you know, we need to understand in higher education, and I say this all the time, students are our allies, not our adversaries. You know, they want the same things we want. You know, they want good, robust, well-funded universities. They want professors who make a living wage and who have the time and the resources and the wherewithal to care about them and their education. They want schools to be doing the right thing ethically. You know, all of the things that we say we want out of higher ed, our students want these things too. So when we approach them with the default mindset that's adversarial, that with an assumption that given any opportunity to game the system, that is the first thing that students will do. I mean, I think, you know, empirical evidence it is rebuttable. It doesn't hold to our experience. We're taking outlier data, as the statisticians would say, and making it the entire story. And that really twists our thinking, you know, because now, you know, I think we're really seeing the flashpoint with this in the debate over remote proctoring and academic honesty. You know, if students are taking an exam, you know, we need to have the webcam on, and, you know, ProctorU uses artificial intelligence to gauge student movements. And if they are atypical or suspicious, it flags that student for the instructor, you know, but the students have to give all sorts of information and log in and create an account on these services. So there's privacy issues, there's data issues. And, you know, if you're not a physically typical or neurotypical student, your behavior, like, you know, if you have ADHD and you're tapping your pencil while you know, moving frequently while you take the exam, or if you've got a condition where you have to use the bathroom facilities more than once, you're going to be flagged as suspicious, right? And so that's one specific example of how we've weaponized this mistrust by default, you know, in the name of some sort of what I think is a warped definition of rigor. You know, we're saying that we are going to put our students literally under surveillance because if we don't, they will cheat. And so if our assumption is that all of our students are going to cheat on an exam, then we need to be asking ourselves, what is it about that exam? What is it about this class that is enabling all of the students to apparently have that seem like the rational choice to make? Because to me, that's a much bigger question. So I think that there are a lot of ways that we can start from a position of trust and engaging and collaborating our students in ways that we think about things like assessments. So, you know, let's start there. Let's not assume the worst and get into this sort of arms race with online proctoring and, you know, student surveillance, because nothing good is going to come out of that.
Yeah, and I think it's really helpful always to remember, you know, which of our own sort of Zoom behaviors and kind of office-based behaviors in our own spaces wouldn't make the cut in that way. So I want to move on. One of the reasons that I was so delighted to have you here today is how meaningful I found your recent book, Radical Hope, in helping me lift my own spirits about trying to do this new enterprise well. I had just bought it when our announcement that we were moving online happened, and I had just started it, and I put it away. I was like, well, now I can't, you know, because this bad thing happened. And it turns out that when I picked it back up, I was very, very glad I did, because it helped reconfirm that some of the things that I knew were just right, like universal design and understanding the difference between, you know, neutrality and fairness in ideology. Things that I knew just right, keep being right over a webcam, and that was enormously comforting and great. But what would you say to faculty and students who are feeling discouraged about the prospect of having a great education or career in the current sort of online hybrid world that seems to be the outlook for at least the next year?
Well, yeah, so I wrote a book on hope before all of this happened, right? And which has been an interesting thing to sort of think through and talk through with people. What I tell my students now, and even though, I direct our teaching center here, but I still teach a course or two a semester. I've been teaching online for several years, actually, is almost all of my course load. So working in this environment is familiar to me, which has been pretty useful, but also helped me kind of think about, students who are doing online as their education, as opposed to face-to-face students who are now suddenly shoved into an online world. And so a few things that come to mind that I would say is it is possible to do meaningful online teaching and learning, and there are thousands of people who are doing that every day. You can have mostly asynchronous classes that still build a sense of community in presence. Now it takes work and it takes support and it takes development, but we can do it. And so I think we need to be cautious of assuming that just because something is now online, that it's automatically inferior. I think, and this has been my own thought process too. And, I've taught in higher ed for 20 years, and my earliest thoughts about higher or online education were that this is a joke, that there's no way this can be meaningful. And I think a lot of times we're very quick to assume that just because something happens in a face-to-face synchronous environment, that it's automatically the pedagogical gold standard. But I would suggest that a 250 person lecture hall, even though it's in person, probably not the pedagogical gold standard. And so now if we're online, are there ways that we can do things online that are better? Are there ways, online should be equal or equivalent to in person, and equivalent doesn't always mean equal. We can get to these learning outcomes. We can do these things in equivalent ways. It's not going to look the same as it would in a face-to-face class, but it can still happen. So I would tell both faculty and students, we have tools. There are people who are doing this well. One of the things that has really, I think, energized me in all of this is the willingness of experts in the online teaching and learning world to share pretty much everything they have. I emailed a friend in my network, like, I'm really struggling trying to figure out how to explain, this particular thing to my faculty. She's like, I've done 5 presentations on it. I'm going to share a Dropbox folder with you. Here it is. There's a lot of resource sharing and community there that we can scale out. And I would also suggest that, I don't want to sound like everything's unicorns and rainbows, because it's not, right? That this gives us an opportunity to really discern what you were talking about earlier, is the inequalities, the structures of inequality that have existed and continue to exist, and now features of which are thrown into very stark relief by this crisis that we're in. And we need to draw from that and understand that those inequalities that we are seeing now are the product of choices that were either made or not made. But it wasn't just, it happened, right? Nothing happens by default. It's the product of choices. And so how do we make different choices if we don't like the way that the previous choices have turned out? And how do we recognize that avoiding something is still a choice that we're making? So how do we engage ourselves? If we're outraged, if we're angry, if we're uncertain, if we're afraid, we're all of those things because of choices that have been made and that have now combined with this pandemic to lay bare the consequences of those choices in a way that we might never have seen otherwise. Let's understand that, and let's act to make different choices. And I think that there are ways that we can take the fear and the anger and the outrage that we feel in a time like this and turn it into actual work, into pushing back against these systems of inequality. And in the world of higher education, that means helping our students develop the consciousness, develop the skills to be able to recognize that their current world is a product of choices, which they may not have made, but were made for them. So it's out, as Paulo Freire says, how do you get students to reach the point where they can actively intervene in their own reality? That's what we need to be after, I think. How do we get students to be critically conscious enough to actively intervene as opposed to just sort of passively spectate their own reality? We have an opportunity to do that in ways that we haven't before. The circumstances that produce that opportunity are awful, but let's seize the opportunity.
Yeah. So I want to take a moment to acknowledge a wonderful comment that came through on the chat about the importance of academic integrity, because one student's dishonesty can actually function as unfairness to other students. And I think that's a really fantastic framing for students. Most often in the times that I say no to a request for some form of extra credit or change in things, it results from, you know, the conclusion, if I do this, it actually is unfair to others. And I always answer that way. So one of the things that I'm really conscious of in this online environment is having conversations about fairness to students that explicitly bring in, you know, there are certain of the practices we're going to do that are about fairness to everyone. And that includes, you know, this sticky issue of synchronous versus asynchronous teaching. One of the things that I've noted is that when we did the pivot, there was very good advice given to us at American University to try to be asynchronous. So not, you know, just take the whole classroom and put it in a new room called Zoom. Because we have international students sharing space, privacy issues, time zone issues, a variety of reasons that just moving to a different room called Zoom wouldn't be the right choice. And I was really glad to see a focus on that particular kind of inequity sort of brought to the fore as teachers, you know, set up what we would do, set up our pivot in very little time. And my pivot included addressing that. That being said, coming into this new thing where we're not doing a pivot, everybody who's online or hybrid in the fall will have mindfully, intentionally selected that, maybe against the alternative of nothing, but so we'll be in a little different space from, you know, you started this way and that's not an educational promise you can continue to fulfill in this one space at 11:20 on Tuesdays and Fridays. But it seems like now there's a tension between addressing those types of inequities that make asynchronous learning so worth doing and so equal access in those particular ways, and dealing with the fact that our students are thirsty for access to connection, that just as before, for example, asynchronous recorded online learning can be enormously useful for some groups of students, whether it was my students observing Ramadan or my students with chronic illnesses for whom classroom presence sometimes is challenging. So too, a disembodied recording or an asynchronous lesson plan might be less accessible for some learners and might also be very much the thing that students are missing most and that colleges have sort of thrived and frankly monetized, providing that back and forth among people, that community. And you mentioned rigor earlier. For me, the little rigor machine in my classes is often me coming in and asking a tougher question in real time than the classmates and peers might have done. So how do we navigate this, this tension of, you know, going forward?
Well, those are the same questions that we're wrestling with here at Grandview. You know, my university is a small liberal arts college of about 1,700 students. We're primarily residential. Our calling card is the small class size, the individual attention, the learning is community, you know, all of these things that are now seeming to be disrupted with a pivot to online. And so our faculty have been preparing for the fall. You know, obviously scenarios are moving too fast for anyone to be certain. But it seems very likely that even if we are conducting face-to-face instruction in the fall, to some degree, it's likely going to involve social distancing, smaller groups, and we're also likely going to have both students as well as faculty and staff who cannot be with us in person because of underlying health conditions or some other factor, where we're going to need to be able to make sure that they too are not pushed to the margins, right? And so you basically have to prepare for everything. And so what we have settled in on, as a lot of institutions are now talking about, is this hybrid flexible model, or HighFlex. And so it used to be if you Googled HighFlex, Hy-FLEX, you would get some industrial bonding company that made this product. But now it's all about HighFlex course design, which has actually been around for almost 15 years. It started with a guy named Brian Beatty at San Francisco State in a graduate education program. And what HighFlex is, and I think why a lot of us are looking at it for the fall, is it's a class that has basically 3 pathways. And students choose or at least in the model, the way the model works is students choose, how they're going to engage and how they're going to learn either on a particular day, during a particular week, or for a particular topic or module. And there are 3 pathways: in-person, synchronous, kind of traditional; online, but also synchronous. So you're streaming what's happening in class via webcam, something like Zoom, and the students who are attending online are participating using either the chat or asking questions and such. And then online asynchronous. And so what the HighFlex model says is you have to build equivalencies for each of these pathways, and you have to figure out ways for students to engage, not just with you, but with one another, even if they're in that asynchronous path. And so you're basically building a face-to-face and an online course, but you're braiding them together. And what I really like about the model, and even in quote unquote normal times, what it does is it really puts the emphasis on student agency. Students for a particular week or a particular topic will say, okay, I'm going to do this online, but synchronously. Or a student who, and that can change, the next topic, they may choose another pathway. And so what it does is it gets rid of a lot of the sort of one-on-one attendance accommodations we have to make, a student who's traveling for a university event, a student who got called into work unexpectedly, a student who has illness or a family issue. We don't have to say, you make things up. We say, okay, you're on the online asynchronous this week if that's how you want to attend. And this is the pathway or the agenda that you will use for this module. So it builds in flexibility, it lets students choose, but in a very uncertain fall that we've got looming before us, it offers us, I think, the best chance to do the kind of things that we want to do, that is, be in community with our students, at least some synchronous element to that, but also acknowledge and make plans for the fact that it's likely not going to be fully in person and that it will be changing. And that students may have to change or institutions may have to do a pivot again. For us, I think the hybrid flexible model offers us a structure that's the most pivotable, but also has that flexibility baked in. A lot of our students work at least 30 hours a week. 99% of our students are on financial aid. We have a lot of student athletes. And so scheduling and attendance and things like that are always things that we're working on at Grandview. And so the hybrid flexible model for us, I think, answers more of our questions than other structures do for what things might look like this fall. And I think what's really important for that is it gets us thinking about things like, how are we doing equivalent learning activities even if a student's in a different mode? How are we getting students to engage with one another outside of a face-to-face synchronous environment? How are we making sure that all of these things are accessible for students no matter which of these particular pathways they're taking in a particular course module? Those are all things that we need to be thinking about anyway. So it's a great teaching and learning conversation. But for us, what it also does, I think, is it's very likely that we would have classes that have to be broken into subgroups for students who attend in person. We've got, our classrooms are only so big. And if you have to be X amount of feet apart, then maybe a classroom that holds 30 can now only hold 10. So some students would go on a Monday, another group on a Wednesday, another group on a Friday, even if we're back on campus, right? And so this HighFlex model offers us a way to sort of rotate groups through in person as well as meet the needs of them in an online environment as well.
Does that get easier? So one of the things that I've noticed both teaching online and being, an order muppet in a household of chaos muppets is I feel like I am serving as the executive function for an enormous group. And everything that you just described sounds really right. And I think about, just in my brief experience with spring 2020, how much more planning it takes.
Oh, it's a shitload more work. Pardon my language.
It is a shitload more work. And nobody's right. Nobody's compensation is changing or anything like that. So there's, and I think from the student end, one of the things that I really noticed too late and that I'll be changing, I really noticed by way of my fatigue from being copied on all of the emails to my 10th grade sons, classes, all of their teachers. I didn't understand, as the person who's one professor for people who take like 5 classes, what it would feel like to be getting these communications from all of your classes until I was copied on it for someone's high school education. And I went, oh, wow,
Mm-hmm.
One thing, it's like you constantly want to improve it and make it great, so you send another email and another email. It was exhausting me, and then I got an image of nobody, not even me, is organized enough to handle this onslaught of information coming by way of email and the learning management systems and all the ways that that it comes, particularly if you're a person, you know, taking 5 classes. So does it get easier to sort of be the executive function for this? And are there best practices you can advise people sort of to not be on the doling out end of the impossible to track, well-intentioned, you know, connectedness thing that happens?
Those are great questions. And yeah, I mean, when we talk about online learning for, you know, and I have a 12-year-old and a 15-year-old at home, and, you know, the same thing with all the emails and text messages. And somehow my name got put on each school's distribution list twice. So I was getting twice the volume of all of these for each kid. It was, you know, I didn't have the bandwidth for it. And I realized, you know, my students didn't have the bandwidth for a lot of this. And I think, you know, if we're continuing at least in somewhat of an online format going forward, which I think we will be, I think we could take some of those lessons and do this better. You know, obviously we need to be communicating openly, honestly, and empathetically with our students, but there are ways that we can do that without sending them an email a day. If we have an email that's more than a paragraph, start out with 4 bullet points or so. You know, here are the things that I'm going to talk about in this email. Boom, 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 boom. And then the information below that to give them, you know, a way to navigate through a longer text message. I think one of the things that's the hardest about teaching online is the realization that it can by default be very text mediated between you and students. And so what are ways to break out of that and personalize it? So in one of my classes, instead of a weekly email to students that introduces the new module and, you know, it makes announcements and logistics, I record a brief 3-minute video on my cell phone and upload it to YouTube and then share it with my students that way. And so it's just a real informal, hey, here's what's going on. I auto caption it through YouTube, and then I embed it in Blackboard as well. So they see me and hear me as opposed to read another long damn email from somebody. And that's, you know, so how are ways that we can break up this routine and remember the fact that our students are probably not bringing the full resources of their cognitive bandwidth to us every day, and making allowances for that. So being generous in the way that we, you know, what are we asking of students and how are we asking it? You know, the perspective of a parent of school, you know, school-age children and seeing what they're getting, I think can really inform the way that we communicate with our students. So, you know, if we felt overwhelmed, imagine how our kids felt, right? So I think just, you know, being much more mindful and intentional about the ways we communicate, being mindful of the frequency or lack thereof, you know, not every day, but certainly not every other week either. And then letting our students know what they can expect from us. You know, so if I tell my students, you know, if you email me, give me up to 24 hours to respond. If you haven't heard from me within 24 hours, then remind me, you know, forward your email to me or send me another one. If you send me a text message or a voicemail, I'll try to get back to you that same day. You know, that's what you can expect from me. So trying to take as much of the uncertainty out of that process, remembering that we're not going to be physically present with them in many of the same ways that either they or us are used to.
Thanks. So I have one more question before we move to questions from our participants. And this is pivoting slightly. So one of the things that Project on Civil Discourse is interested in as well is dialogue across difference. That means different things to different people. And often when I'm in spaces of on-campus free speech, you know, what I hear is that absolute sort of neutrality relative to partisanship is this virtue in education regardless. And I tend to swim upstream against that. You know, my campus is tobacco free. We have an orthodoxy about that. And we might have orthodoxies about whether it's okay to harass people, for example. It's complicated. But I've noticed, you know, how much more complicated it feels like it might be in 2020, a year whose motto could be, I can't believe I have to say this. Like, I can't believe I have to say that your decision whether to infect people with a mask is, you know, with your droplets by not wearing a mask is not a partisan question. It is just, it's very simply an objective, you know, are you exposing yourself and others to infection or not? And one of the things I've admired in both Radical Hope and in your work on Twitter is that you are pretty, you know, you're pretty transparent about being a person with an orientation, with a viewpoint, who's drawn to conclusions in his years on this planet. And what I'd like to know is if you have anything, you know, any words of guidance, wisdom, help for people who are going to continue to be human beings while we're teaching online in an election year, in an environment where now even more than ever, professors are called out for having a political viewpoint, even if it's one as simple as, you know, I liked it when that elected official wore a mask, that was responsible. And how to help build classrooms where it's clear that, you know, our existence as people who have come to conclusions about things in this world isn't inconsistent with having an inclusive, inspiring classroom where inquiry is really valued.
Yeah, those are great questions, and you know, stuff I think about a lot. And I am very outspoken politically, and my students know where I stand. And you know, I certainly don't, you know, stand in front of a bully pulpit in front of the classroom and say, here is why I am a socialist. But I mean, if they listen to me, they understand. And I think it's disingenuous to pretend that if students know where I stand politically, then somehow that's going to ruin the educational experience, right? I think that infantilizes students. You know, students are aware that people, you know, think differently than them. And if they aren't, they should be. So this is one way of doing it. You know, obviously I'm mindful, you know, it certainly isn't something like you must agree with me or else you'll get less than an A in the class or something like that. What I try to foster in my classes and with and among my students is a truly inclusive, equitable community. And we talk about that in the beginning of a course. We all collaborate. You know, what does this mean to you? How do you learn best? What are things that get in the way of your learning? And so how are we going to structure this community, whether it's in person or online, around these things that will help you learn and minimize the barriers to your learning? And what does that mean for your own responsibilities? And what does that mean for us as a group? What expectations are we going to hold each other to? And how is that going to happen? Those conversations go so much better collaboratively rather than me being the cop and saying, do this, but don't do that, right? And then students are invested. You know, all of us have built this set of expectations for our community. We're all invested in holding it up. So there's no gotcha moments if somebody, you know, acts unskillfully in a particular context. I think we make too much of this idea of objectivity. You know, objectivity is not neutrality, as the historian Thomas Haskell has argued. And I would argue there's really, you know, sort of no such thing as objectivity. We're all coming from somewhere. We're all informed by things. We are living within structures that are the products of choices. To ignore that is actually to exacerbate some of the things that we ought to be fighting against. So if I say, you know, both sides have equal value, you know, as so much of our media tends to do now, then I'm automatically raising arguments to a false equivalence in many cases. You know, it's like Karl Popper said with his paradox of tolerance, right? That, you know, the non-negotiables are nobody's basic humanity is up for debate. Nobody's civil rights are up for debate. You know, you're not allowed to harm anybody in this community. Those are not things that are open to negotiation. And so many times we tend to say, well, you know, freedom of speech, when it's used that way, marginalizes the already marginalized. And I think a lot of times that's sort of a weaponized concept that's used for docility rather than respect. And I think we need to be very careful of that. Our students, or many of them, are still sort of finding their own identities. And in many of the cases of our students, you know, I know a lot of students who come from rural areas into the capital city of the state. Here in Des Moines, you know, we're not a huge metropolitan area, but for our students from farm country, you know, this is a big change. And so a lot of their received expectations and how things are now all in flux. And we have to make space for that, you know, because that's a really hard process and can be very fraught for people. But I don't think we make space for that by pretending it doesn't exist. And I don't think that we make space for a diversity of viewpoints by pretending that we have none. I think that's really dangerous. And I think our students see through that.
I think that sounds right. And I think one thing that you've outlined that I just want to draw out a bit before we move to questions from our participants is that college is a transition, and whether it's the transition from a rural area into a more urban one, or just simply the transition from K to 12 education, which is a highly speech regulated sort of command and control approach to expression, into college, which is very different. It's new, it's different, and each student experiences that transition as a very different one too. Many students, college becomes a more diverse community than they've been in, for example. So I think anything we can be doing to have conversations about what this difference is and how this difference plays out in our classrooms. I think those of us who are going to want to be attracting students to higher ed and saying, please stick it out, even if it looks different than the brochures did, have to be having this conversation too. What you're doing is different. It's not like your AP bio class online was last year. This is college. But we cannot expect them to just emerge into our classroom, whether it is a virtual class, a digital classroom, or a physical one, truly understanding what that means. And it just seems like explicitness is so incredibly important.
Yeah, radical transparency about, what this is and how we model it. And we also need to understand that, anytime somebody's doing something new, it's not always going to be skillful. And there's going to be a lot of unskillful moments. And that's true for me as well. So how do we model navigating around those? I think that's a really important thing for us to think about for our students too.
Which is a great mindset, I think, to have, to get back to the very first thing you brought in, which was building trust in these communities. If you're assuming good faith with lots of bumbling possible in people, you're going to experience a conversation with them very differently than if you're sort of assuming bad faith. And I think the capacity to assume that people are just in the process of getting good at this enables classmates to be in community with one another more easily. But we, I think, have to, particularly in an era where everyone with a Twitter handle is an expert on something, give students permission to see themselves as others and us as works in progress who are just, trying.
Well, you described my entire academic career right there. Good faith with lots of bumbling. So
I've been toying around with the idea of informed generosity, looking at people as like rebuttably trying their best, but just not being Charlie Brown, constantly falling for the, for Lucy's antics. So anyway, I would love to open this to our participants. You can raise your hand and our SPA events person who's on can unmute you, or if you'd like, you can use the chat function to ask your questions. Otherwise, we'll just sort of keep talking. I actually can't see the hand raise thing.
So, hi, I just got unmuted. Hi, I'm Bill Harder. And so I'm a political scientist and teach in our School of Public Affairs and our School of International Service. So, first of all, Kevin, just thanks for everything you do in the Twitter sphere and the amount that you put out. I just want to be on record as saying that, the amount of things that you tweet, that's service that, we need to quantify and find a way to put on a CV. So certainly service to the discipline. But so here's what I've been thinking a lot about, which are sort of the experiences that students are going to bring back with them in the fall after this summer. We typically have a narrative kind of both on the student side and the faculty side about what happens in the summer, be that internships or jobs or study abroads, right? But given the context of this, a lot of students are going to come back to us in person or virtually, or whatever that looks like, right? With an absence of those experiences, or in place of those experiences, a whole different set that are often going to be ripe with sort of trauma. And so a lot of the conversation that I've seen in these places thinks about, what the fall is going to look like differently logistically. And how we interact with them, which it obviously has to, but I also think there's this pedagogical question about how we think this is going to change the conversations and the ways that we teach the things that we teach in our courses, and how we interact with our students and how they come to that information. So I'd just be very interested to hear if you have any thoughts about that, about how it's also going to change the content and the types of discussions that we're going to be having in class. So thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. That's a fantastic question. Yes, absolutely. I think, all of us in the spring, when we pivoted, we're grieving. We were grieving the loss of things that we were counting on happening. So it was our seniors who are grieving the loss of their commencement ceremony. Our first year students in the fall, they lost half their senior year of high school and all the sort of rituals and things that go with that. And so your allusion to this idea of sort of trauma-informed pedagogy, I think, is a really important one. And this is all just sort of on the surface level, to say nothing of students who are experiencing the inequities that we've been talking about, on a really firsthand kind of visceral basis. And I think what we need to do, no matter what discipline and area we're teaching, is we need to make space for these conversations to happen early on in our classes, and allow students to talk about, what was this experience like for us? If we're going to be doing digital or largely digital learning in the fall, let's ask our students, what was this like for you in the spring? What worked? What didn't? What can we do in this space to fix some of those things? Or if there were things that worked really well, how can we bring those things into this space in order to have this work really well too? And I think acknowledging and affirming the student experience, and affirming it in the sense that, yeah, this matters pedagogically, and this can have an influence on how we shape our time together this semester in this space, I think could be a really important step to take. We need to be present with our students and allow them to be present with one another. And starting off classes with this type of conversation, not just, hey, let's yell about online learning for 45 minutes, but kind of a structured or guided reflection, I think can accomplish those things and is a really good first step into moving into that area that you've talked about. So thanks, Bill. That's a great point, and I think one that we need to kind of keep front of mind.
We have this question on the chat from Heather, which I'm going to read. How do you find the increase in non-academic student neediness? We generally have a lot of hand-holding with personal issues, and our institution has largely ignored the faculty requests for support and training because we are not mental health experts. The outreach for help for counseling, personal FaceTime therapy sessions, having to do mandatory reporters for domestic abuse, etc., has increased significantly. Any ideas on how to navigate these life issues for students without oversharing? Our institution needs to refer issues to support staff outside the department, which violates students' confidentiality and trust. So a lot, but it's a really important question.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think it touches on, some of the things that Bill brought up as well. I'm a really big proponent of the ways that what the clinical counseling community calls trauma-informed care can inform our pedagogy. I think and there are people who write about a trauma-informed pedagogy as well, where, we look at students, they're not coming to us from a vacuum. And one of the things that I really think my university has done well, and that I'm exceedingly thankful for, is acknowledging this reality, right? Like, we are in contact with students more than anybody else on campus, but we are not mental health experts. We are not trained to be these things, and we shouldn't just approach our relationships with students like, here's what I can and can't do legally. I think one of the things that was so helpful for us is our counseling staff has worked with faculty, whether in general faculty sessions or smaller faculty development sessions, and I've co-sponsored some through my teaching center, where they work with us on principles of trauma-informed care and how does this overlap with pedagogy, work through some scenarios, what are some of the things that students are wrestling with. We see, they can obviously speak only in very general terms. We see these things when we work with students. What are some ways that classroom spaces, can help be environments where some of the sharper edges might be done. So, I think it's easier to collaborate across units at a smaller institution, but if you can get a space where counseling staff who are working with your students can be in conversation with teaching faculty, that's a wonderful opportunity. And in our case, it's led to kind of an ongoing relationship where we have these opportunities regularly. And we even have a session that's built into our new faculty orientation because it was so well received by the rest of our colleagues. And I think that that's really important because they are the experts and they can share insights with us on how even as non-experts, but yet people that are in contact with these students so much. What are our spaces like, and how might we be more skillful in handling what is becoming, only more and more of a complex and prevalent issue?
Yeah, and a couple of things to add. One, just our own American University Center for Teaching, Research, and Learning. There have been a couple of sessions we've done on trauma-informed pedagogy in the past that are still up on the site on video. But I think one thing to remember when dealing with one of these situations, the chances are, if you're a teacher, you're someone who either has the personality trait or has gotten very good at being a very self-sufficient, self-contained, yes, I can person who pours in, who doesn't like to just can't anything that comes to you. And that's probably why so many of us were able to do the pivot as effectively as we did in as short a time. But one thing to kind of remember is, for me, myself, if I ask myself the question, would I want me as my therapist? Whoa, the answer is a resounding no. Sometimes that thing that both, higher ed not being terribly well funded or having a ton of, support staff, that mindset that makes us so resourceful in how we use resources and put in the extra time as teachers, I'd say specifically often faculty, we want to think about, apply the standard of like, is the thing that I'm doing good stuff? Am I actually the best person to do this? If my student comes to me with car troubles, I'm not going to look at their car because I'm not a mechanic. And something to remember is that one of the most loving things we can do is direct people to resources more appropriate than ourselves that can really help with this stuff. So there's being good at understanding how your teaching can be trauma informed, and your courses can be universally designed to the fullest extent possible so that you're not getting in your students' way. But then remembering that if you take on the therapist role, there's an extent to which you're getting in your students' way, because you're not the person who's qualified to do this. And it can be liberating instead of looking at it mentally as I've shunted this responsibility, but I've actually taken the responsibility to put the student in contact with the person who really does this.
And I just put an article in the chat. I put an article in the chat to Kate Denial's work on what she calls a pedagogy of care. She's written a couple things on that, so you can Google that, her name and that phrase, and really thoughtful stuff that's I think along the lines of what we're talking about, but will really spur some good thought and reflection too.
I think we'll share that article as well in the PC newsletter, so thank you for that.
Great.
I was just looking at the written comments here, the written questions here. There's a question about your work on decolonization.
Yeah, I'm looking at it right now. So work on decolonization and especially coming from a settler perspective. I am the product of literal settler colonialism. My immigrant family settled on Homestead Act land in South Dakota when they got to the United States. That a big part of my family did. I think one of the ways that it's informed both my teaching and faculty development work the most is really getting me to think about ways of knowing and the types of sort of knowledge production and ways of knowing that we have inherently privileged in higher education. Again, this idea of objectivity and, quote unquote rationality, these sort of Western Enlightenment based tropes that, has structured the way that the university system has evolved historically is very much a product of that. And so thinking about ways that we can, decenter some of those and help students think about ways of knowing, and in particular, ways of knowing that are actually oppressive, and being able to name that, getting out of this sort of, what Laura Rendon calls them agreements that sort of structure higher education. You know, we all agree that X amount or X type of scholarship is the real scholarship. And we agree that, you know, promotion and tenure and ranking means something. And, you know, where do all these agreements come from? You know, what mode do they represent? And in many ways, they sort of come back to this idea of exclusion and monopolization of resources, as well as culture, that stems from kind of a settler colonial perspective. And trying to name that, realize I'm in the middle of it, and also try to step outside of it is really hard sort of self work, but I think absolutely essential, not just for, I think, for me to be a better teacher and to work more skillfully with my students, but again, to sort of dismantle these structures that we're in and to offer counter narratives to the ones that have become so hegemonic. And so for me, you know, getting into the literature on settler colonialism, you know, almost over a decade ago now, and where that, you know, as a historian, it was that was my scholarly entree into it, but it challenged me so much and unsettled me, pardon the pun, that it really has moved into this sort of larger perspective for me, and provides a sort of continual stimulus to try to think and do more generously than might usually be the inclination.
Well, we're almost out of time. We have 2 minutes. There's a great question in the chat about moving group work online.
Mm-hmm.
Actually something I think about all the time. So one thing I'll say is that this summer, my colleague Andrea Brenner and I will be releasing some resources about collaborative learning, class engagement, and some other aspects of facilitating trust and discourse. So I hope you'll actually email me and so that we can send you that. But if that person in the chat contacts me, I think we can also take that conversation face-to-face a little bit as well. So we are just about out of time. I don't know if we have time for one more question or maybe parting thoughts, Kevin. How about parting thoughts from you?
Yes, I think, you know, none of us know what's happening, right? None of us know what we're doing fully. And that's both scary and liberating at the same time, harkening back to a point you made earlier, Lara, that, you know, it turns out that we in higher ed have been carrying around a lot of stuff, you know, and some of that stuff is good, but some of that stuff is maybe not so constructive. And so I think, you know, we have an opportunity, again, not only to sort of name inequitable structures that we're in, but to use that and try, you know, try to conduct or create a better narrative than the one that we've had. Right now, you know, the default narrative is the powerful one because there aren't convincing counter narratives. Well, you know, some of those are emerging now, and let's see what those look like. And let's also, you know, I think one of the other things that has been really useful is we're not the experts in everything now. That has been revealed to us as well. You know, someone could be a brilliant scholar, but not know how to run a Zoom meeting, right? And so what are the sources of collective knowledge that we have in the community, among our colleagues, and how do we value and affirm that in ways that we haven't before? You know, let's you know, the opportunity that, you know, we're in comes from circumstances that none of us want, but, you know, let's see if we could use the opportunity to fashion, you know, we shouldn't go back to the way things were or back to normal. That was unsustainable. So as we look at whatever this new normal is, you know, let's think about, you know, the choices that we're going to make and the stories that we're going to tell to shape it, and to do so alongside, with, and among our students.
I think that's a great, and I would dare say hopeful, way to conclude. Thank you, Kevin, so much for kicking off this series, and everyone for joining in. Looking forward to seeing many of you, I hope, back in the future. And Kevin, thank you very, very much. We have lots of hope now.
Thanks to everybody. Honored to spend some time with you today. Thank you for being here.
Little Zoom wave.
That's right.